continue today. You can watch it. If you are watching it either through Zoom or Ecolas on our Ecolas webpage, but you can send your question through Slido. So please do so, because we had a wonderful conversation yesterday. By the way, we had about 80 people watching us, including those who are at Zoom. So that's a very good number, and hopefully there will be even more those who watch and will discuss with us today. Hopefully your friends and colleagues. Hans Adriaansens, after whom the competition or the award was named, is a founder of liberal arts in Netherlands and a co-founder of Ecolas, and joined us yesterday, and he would be happy to join us today, but because he is over 75, I think he's very careful, and today has a first face-to-face meeting with his friends that he planned for a month. So he didn't join us, he chose that, and we fully agree with his decision, because that's a big thing, up to 1 year of isolation and solitude. But fortunately, thanks to technology, we can hear his voice, not his picture, because we had some technical difficulties, but it'll be a few minutes. He's short, succinct, and very to the point. And then Larry Butch will take over, and Tune Decker later on. So please, if you can turn on the Hans Adriaansens speech.
Okay, maybe there will also be the image. Let's see.
And let me first start by saying that I'm very grateful to the board of Ecolas, not only for having established an award program in my name, which is the type of honor that is normally given to people who have passed away some time ago, which I most obviously haven't. And I'd like to thank the board also for giving me the opportunity to say a few words to the award winners, to the students, who I congratulate very much on being chosen by the board as award winners. Yesterday and this morning, I had the chance to read all their papers, and also the reports you wrote on how you engage with peers and friends, and what kind of discussions you engaged in. I must say I was impressed, and I'm still impressed, because together we touched on very many issues, like democratization of vegetarianism. We talked about climate change, health problems, the threat of COVID and future pandemics. We wrote about inequality, racism, gender, prejudice, intolerance, propaganda, and disinformation. And most importantly, I think we wrote about so-called modern ways of twisting the truth and creating fake realities. Very exciting. We rightly emphasized the effects that all these issues have on the perspective and challenges of young people. And many of you complained about how, particularly in this age of baby boomers like myself, how real intellectual potential has been neglected. Some wrote, and I quote, that we, the youth, are butterflies with broken wings. You didn't stop at self-pity, though. Many of you put your cards and your hopes on education. But we also said immediately all this education and higher education in particular should then be much better organized than it has been for decades. And this is where Ecolas comes in. Ecolas was established to reinvent higher education, particularly in the bachelor stage. From its very start, Ecolas has tried to free our universities from the industrial, large-scale, and anonymous setup that became prominent in the second half of the 20th century. Since then, students and faculty have almost lost meaningful interaction, face-to-face contact. Teaching and learning were narrowed down to the transfer of mostly monodisciplinary knowledge. And what is most important, almost no attention was given to what always has been the basis of the production of our type of knowledge, and that is the community, the academic community. And of course, all this was aggravated, was made worse by the COVID pandemic. You know, I'm a sociologist, I'm not a priest. I don't believe in good intentions alone. Just praying for nice weather doesn't make the sun shine. If moral appeals are the only instrument we have for making this a better world, I'm sure it wouldn't help us much. What we do need is a social infrastructure that steers us in the right direction. And that is also true, and particularly true for higher education. Therefore, Equitas has been promoting 3 elementary principles of organization, of organizing our universities. I mean, the first principle is that we should focus within the university on the small-scale college idea, college where students and teachers have the chance to get to know each other well, become persons instead of anonymous individuals. The second principle is that the converging liberal arts curriculum should replace a monodisciplinary program. This may help students to capitalize on their own developing interests and come to grips with complex dilemmas. And the third principle is what I have called a culture of diversity. That's a culture in which students and faculty come from diverse national and international backgrounds that will force them to understand and, more importantly, to appreciate a variety of viewpoints. Luckily, there are signs now that this development is getting momentum in many universities throughout Europe. But we certainly haven't reached what we wished for at the start of Equitas. I honestly hope that you can bring us closer to that goal. And considering the work that you have done, and considering the reports you've written and the papers you've written, and the discussions we're about to have, I'm very optimistic indeed. And for now, I wish you and the Equitas board a very productive webinar. Good luck.
Well, I realized that the reception was very, very poor, but we promise you that we will send you his speech. We have it, so you can really appreciate his fine words. I don't know whether you could hear it, but I almost couldn't, but we'll send it to you. Okay, Larry.
Well, okay, let's get started on today's discussion. We'll run over the format one more time. You each have about 5 minutes to summarize your discussions. We've read your papers. We're very impressed with what you have to say. We'll have 1 or 2 questions and comments. But what we'll do is go through each of the presentations first. The first, I guess we'll do the first 3. I don't see Amar on here yet. So we'll start with Anna-Sophie, and then we'll move on to Julia, and then Celine, right? And we'll go from one presentation to the next, and then we'll save our discussion for after we've heard all 3 of those. And then we'll take a little break if we need a little break, and then I'll pass the baton to Toon, and we'll take care of the second part of the presentations, and then we will still have time left for what we know will be a very vibrant and active discussion of these themes and the themes that you have discovered It's been a very interesting exercise for us, I can tell you. We really enjoy it. We had over 100 applications, and we read through them all. And we learned a great deal, but we learned the most from you all, and that's why you are here. So let's get started. Anna Sophie, you have the floor.
Oh, okay, right, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I have a presentation, but I think I'd rather maybe just point out and talk directly, because I think that would make me foster the conversation better.
Okay.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll preface quickly that we were 10 people in the conversation that was held on Zoom. And I did have a difficulty in finding a diverse group of people, especially in terms of diversity of thought. It seemed like we were very much on the same page about a lot of the topics. So the first thing that I thought was very interesting based on the conversation that I've had was that it was so much about ideology. There are all this, like, when there were topics of climate change, it was just as much a topic of neoliberalism, for instance. So the first thing that was discussed was, or rather the big takeaway from that for me, was that there was a concern that normative discussions were being had on topics, or rather in spaces where they shouldn't be, and vice versa, where they should be, they aren't being had. So for instance, questions about whether people deserve human rights or not should not even be up to debate. But questions, and especially the COVID pandemic, I think kind of highlighted this, conversations about how we should structure society and how we should value certain things. For example, the healthcare sector did play an important role, and we should be having these conversations, especially after COVID. One big issue that I was very impressed to hear was also the people mentioned religious topics, religious wars being a concern to them. And not just that they are concerned because they don't have the tools, they felt that they didn't have the tools to address these issues, especially in their private lives. So what a lot of people raised, I thought that was quite endearing, is like, yeah, we criticize politicians for not handling these crises well enough, but even in our families, I have a hard time confronting my parents about their racist views or their homophobic views, and so on and so forth. So I thought that was really, I didn't expect that, to be honest. It's always easier to point fingers, but if you don't have the means to, or rather the tools to even address that in your own family, I thought that was a really nice vision of that. There was also a huge talk about institutionalism and the kind of the dwindling trust in institutions, especially the UN. What I thought was interesting is that they mentioned that there was a shift. So even if their own countries didn't uphold like human rights standards, they always were in the belief that the international institutions such as the UN would do that for them. So they would uphold these standards in their countries, or at least condemn human rights abuses. And I don't mean to make this about politics, but there was because it was the conversation was placed during the Israel-Palestine conflict. People were mentioning that the US, for instance, was advocating or endorsing a ceasefire, but then voted against it in the Security Council, which would have had an immediate effect. So people were like, well, I don't trust, if I can't even trust now international organizations that are there to uphold peace, then it's really hard for me to believe that things can change for the better. And then there were also historical examples being brought, like Srebrenica, where the UN was not just idle in handling these problems, but even actively expelling people from their safe zones. So there was like this, a little bit distrust coming up from the conversation, and which translated into not really being hopeful. And that was also, I think, a big point for me, that there was not that much conversation about solutions, to be honest. There was a hope that technology would be something that could be used as a tool to improve the lives, and that they felt that the younger generations are more sensibilized to certain issues. But given the fact that on an institutional level, there isn't much response, or in their opinion, they didn't feel like that there was so much to be done, which brings me to my last point about whether young people are heard or not. I think from my own personal experience, like I'm active in the German Youth Council, I think the biggest problem is that the spheres of influence don't overlap. I think young people are very much in youth associations, they're active in civil society a lot of the times, but they're not organizing themselves in unions. They're not in parties. I can give many examples from my friends who are doing lots of things, but they're not in the traditional mediums of politics. And I think that's maybe also a reason why they're not maybe overlooked, is because they're not in these venues. And then the last part about this is, and I thought that was really interesting, is that someone mentioned it's not that we're not overlooked or overheard because we don't have any arguments. It's precisely because we have arguments. It's very uncomfortable sometimes holding up a mirror to a generation who may have been the cause, or at least didn't solve a problem. So it's seen as threatening. And the problem with that is that it gets very discouraging. We had someone, he's from Ireland, and he was a climate ambassador. And he said that he went on a radio talk show and then he got like hate messages afterwards from multiple people, and that he felt that was so disencouraging. And now he stopped doing that because he was like, I don't see, it's not just exhausting to me, but it's just disencouraging me from actually entering any kind of conversation about this. So I thought that was interesting. It's not always that it's overlooked. Sometimes it's like specifically excluded, but in this case, it's just, yeah, maybe even precisely because we have arguments that these demands are not met.
Good. Well, thank you, Anna Sophie. I have to say, when I read through your paper, I thought that this group that you dealt with was different than most of the other groups in terms of the way the conversation went. And there are some very interesting aspects of this which we'll want to follow up with during our discussion. But even sort of different terms, and I think you're right. There was a little focus on solutions, although there was an interesting idea about the community welfare economies and that sort of thing. So we'll get back to that later on. But that was a very interesting group you were with, and thanks for passing that along to us. Julia, you all set?
I will share my screen.
Okay.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, first, I want to say thank you for this opportunity and for choosing. My name is Yulia Lysakovska, and I'm from Belarus. My university is EHU University, and it's not like only a liberal art university, it's also a political project and university refugee. Thank you to Lithuania, they adopt us, and that's why we're still alive as a university. My main worries, surely it's a political situation in my country, because now I'm outside, and I think now it's not possible to come back, and it's not a good idea. But also I'm really worried about women's rights in our world, not only in Belarus or in the European continent. We have problems. We still have a huge problems with this thing. My main worry is not only women's rights, but also situation in my country, because our future is really like a black screen, and a lot of Belarusians now in Poland or in Lithuania or in Ukraine and other countries, and we don't know what to do. And I feel that, sometimes it's possible to hear that all people are equal, but it's not true. And I feel myself like in a cell because of my nationality, because of my gender, and because of my position, because I left my country and I feel myself more safe, but I'm in Poland, in a very conservative country, and as a woman, I still feel myself unsafe. I also have worries about media literacy, because in Belarus now we can read articles like non-government articles only in our children channels, and I think it's really important now to learn and to learn how to read the article, how to make a fact-checking, because it's so many of propaganda information now, not only in Belarus, they're still in other countries in Europe also. And I add euthanasia law, because Nobody's asking us would like to be born, but I think that it's really important to have a choice, to have this right to choose your when you want to go out from our life or from this life. But when I talk to other students from my university, they have different different worries, and I will start from different hopes and worries, and I will start from worries. So I had some interesting topics. For example, number of psychologists and interest in mental health, and yeah, that's interesting because now we have like an interest in our mental health, but for example, in my country, we are still have a lot of people with the magical thoughts, not the critical thoughts. For example, they believe in astrology or another fake science things, and they can be a doctors or a psychologist. And that's and for me, that's like a horrible situation because that's not a real help for people. Formation of civil society, of Belarusian civil society, because if we will won and Belarus will be free in the future, we have a questions about people who built our country again, because our society is still sexist and homophobic and conservative. So I have doubts about our future. A variety of ways to identify a person. It was interesting for me, and because yeah, now we have a lot of names, we can describe ourselves in a different names, and maybe some in the future we would like to be just like no names, like without any identify. Yeah, lack of clear ideas about life, because now it's hard to prognose our future, what we will do, and how we can manage our future life. What about potential? I had two opposite meaning that from my colleagues, from my students from my university, that some of them, they believe that if you have a potential, you can always realize yourself. But for me, it was like a little surprise because so in my country, it's not possible now to make any performances or videos or just to talk about politics, and it's really hard to show yourself. So I'm not really agree with this meaning in my point. And unfortunately, part of students, they think that they have no talent and no potential at all, and it's really sad. And you know, for me, it was like a bad surprise. But what about hopes? Now we're more interested to discover ourselves and to understand who we are. Now we are more acceptable. So now we're trying to understand ourselves and accept our personalities. Ability of young people to think globally. We can cooperate with other peoples from other countries and create something together. Now, for example, we have this discussion. And as for me, I believe in a young liberal generation, and my hope is for young liberal people to create a better future world. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Yulia, and I think I speak for all of us when we say that we share your concern about Belarus and its current situation. Well understand your nervousness and your fear about Belarus. I will tell you that although we don't expect it to make much difference, Ecolas will be issuing a statement of protest about the recent events in Belarus, and particularly the detention of your colleague there at EHU, Sofia Sapega.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We hope that will resolve itself peacefully. Okay. Well, you raised a lot of questions that we want to get back to, and we'll see. Some of these will flow into some of the other presentations, I think, and some of them are maybe kind of specific to your own situation. So we'll get back to that when we get to the overall discussion. Celine, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't have any presentation or slides. I'm
That's fine.
just talking. Okay. So frustration is the word that I would use to sum up the discussion that I organized and the broader feelings of Europe's youth. Frustration. The youth see their lives go by. They are told to go to college, to get an education. And after years of studies, of hard work, of dreams, they realize that there is no room left for them. Political and governance structures are already full. And no, we don't offer jobs like this to young people. They need to learn first. What we offer them is unpaid internships or underpaid jobs, which they are only eligible for most of the time if they already have work experience. So yes, frustration. Frustration often makes way to anger, to resentment, to disappointment. But the worst is when frustration turns into indifference. A big part of the youth today does not care. I'm not only referring to low voter turnout, but I'm talking about the broader mindset of, according to one of my participants, I pay my taxes, that's my contribution to society. This is not to say that all youth are apathetic in the same way, but the fact that a part is shows that this is a symptom of a wider problem, which is the lack of meaningful inclusion of youth in decision making. It's not a coincidence that political disengagement is most often found amongst the youth, the poor, and minorities. It's because those groups are the ones that are the most excluded. An interesting thought that was brought up during my discussion was the fact that the youth is widely regarded as a bunch of problems to fix. Politicians mentioned that they mention the youth when they talk about education, about drugs, about childhood obesity, about unemployment. See where I'm going with this? It's quite unsettling to realize that the youth is never talked about in positive terms. And the discourse, the narratives that are used, they have an impact on the youth. Youth want their opinions, their ideas, their work to have value, to be taken into consideration rather than being ignored and looked upon with disdain. It's funny how when asked about it, national and international institutions will say, yes, effective participation of youth is a priority of ours, and yet there is no place made for youth. There is no active effort to include youth at national and international levels. There are words and promises, and that is the feeling that could be felt in my discussion. Something that my participants completely agreed upon was how concerning the discrepancy between the perspectives and objectives of the current leadership and those of the youth was. It is pretty simple though. The youth want jobs, they want climate justice, they want human rights, and they want to be included. Basically, they want their future. And yet there are no jobs for the youth, especially in policymaking. There is still no coordinated response to climate change after more than 20 years since the Kyoto Protocol, which is supposedly binding, was signed. Human rights are not advancing fast enough and are in practice even regressing. The youth is still not involved in any decision that will impact their lives, and yet they're still expected to stand by their political leaders. One of my participants said they think we're too young to understand things, to explain why they were not included. But the fact is that youth is not too young to know what they want. They want to have a seat at the table. They want to be properly represented in institutions, to have their interests given recognition. They want their initiatives and projects to be given attention and support. They want to be able to speak for themselves instead of being spoken on behalf of. They want to be in charge of their future, basically. So it is time that we ask ourselves why youth is so overlooked, because it's certainly not because they don't have knowledge, ideas, or willingness to change. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks to all three of you. It's very lively presentations. And let's move on to the discussion phase here. Questions for each other or comments on what you just heard. I will say that I find this very interesting because these presentations today are generally more negative than what we heard yesterday. And that's not a judgment, that's just an observation. And there's a lot of frustration in your voices, a lot of frustration in your writing as well. So let's step back here for a second. Yesterday we heard a lot about specific issues: climate change, media, communication, and that sort of thing. Today we've sort of reached out on a different kind of meta level, more general in a sense, but perhaps certainly equally provocative. So let's hear what you have to say. How do you respond to what you just heard, especially with regard to your own experience and the kinds of things that you're thinking about and the sorts of things that you heard from others? Who would like to start off here? Well, this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much. Here we go. Toon, you have something to say?
Ana Sophie Kloppe would like to speak.
Oh, sorry. I haven't got everybody on the screen. Good. Okay. Ana Sophie. Good.
Yeah, I think that this is also, especially Celine's answer, kind of highlighted what my problem was also with the diversity aspect. And also what Julia said. I mean, they're completely different aspects of what we even conceive as problems. I mean, to think, I haven't met anyone who said they didn't have potential. And also Celine mentioned it's not a problem of not being knowledgeable enough. But when Julia's answers, it was completely a disbelief that there was even potential to begin with. So a different problem setting. And one thing that I also think is important to mention is that I think there are avenues where young people do get involved. I think also in international level, there are the EU youth conferences, the UN youth conferences, and all of those things. They are there. The money is also there. It could be more, but it is there. The problem is just the same people go to them all the time. We were said like 150 young people to devise the German youth strategy. And when we were addressing the issue of diversity being a problem, they were like, no, it's not. How can you say? And we're like, okay, we're going to do an experiment right now. Who here has a high school diploma? Who here is at university? Who here is doing something that they can have a good salary range after graduation? And there were only 2 people who didn't have a high school diploma, 2 people who didn't go to university. So it's the same type of people who go to these and take up these opportunities. I think that's also a thing to mention. It's maybe not so much a problem that they aren't there. It's just who are they being realized by?
Well, I know in one of your papers, someone pointed out that particularly what Ana Sophie's talking about, the question of inequality, right? That there are groups who have access and groups who don't have access. And the groups who don't have access find it very difficult to gain access, whether it's through education or whether it's through economic well-being or political stability, right? And that this inequality measure is something which is involved in every one of the challenges that European youth face, one way or the other. So you pointed out the north-south axis, the difference of in the European context, the northern and southern, and the inequalities that are both perceived and real in those stages. So when Ana Sophie says, yeah, it's always the same people showing up, well, the people who don't show up, maybe it's not because they don't want to, maybe it's because it's a kind of a luxury to get involved in that sort of thing when you're trying to make a living, when you're trying to put food on the table, when you're trying to figure out exactly what you're doing. So hard. Who's going to keep this ball rolling here?
Well, it goes back to this old idea, which is an old thought in philosophy. I'm a political philosopher, and if I put you in a room and the door is open, but you are convinced the door is locked, you won't even try to open it because you think it's locked. And in that sense, the constraint on you that makes you unfree isn't the door, because the door is open. The constraint is you not daring to have a go. And when you're talking about inequality, it seems to me that the real evil of inequality is that it sort of prevents people from even trying. Because it seems to me that the German Youth Conference or institutions would love to hear from people who are not represented. But somehow there's that gap. So maybe the question to you is, you guys are in all these institutions. How do we make them more inviting to people who come from less traditional backgrounds? And how do we get them those people without the high school degrees who aren't at university, who are in worse positions to take the plunge?
I think it has a lot to do with competition nowadays, because what I sensed a lot from people my age is that they always feel like their CV is not exciting enough, or they feel like they need more experience in that field, or they don't have enough internships. And I feel like there's a lot of pressure on our generation to have, for example, a lot of international experience, etc. And I feel like maybe a lot of people are simply not brave enough, because also through technology, we can always compare ourselves with others. And then sometimes people want to apply for things, and then they hear of others who apply and see that they have much more exciting lives, basically. And I feel like it's just that our generation should learn that we can always apply for things, and that we don't already have to be at a certain point in order to like go further. So I feel like it's really this competition thing, that there's always this feeling of not being good enough because we always have the comparison with other people. So it's really just about motivation and giving them the feeling that they are important, that even if you don't even have a high school degree, that you can still go there. So I think competition is basically like the important part here. And we have to kind of find a way to really motivate people, and that they learn that they don't need any exciting CV in order to apply for such programs.
So how do we do that? How do we communicate that to them?
Yeah, I mean, maybe as an answer, maybe I don't know what other people think about that, because it could also maybe be seen as maybe patronizing a little bit, but to actually target these communities specifically, that to, for example, at BARD, they have a program where the people in the neighborhood come and learn English from the students, and then they kind of have a discussion that kind of then just goes on about what are the problems in the neighborhood in general. So I don't know what people think about targeting communities specifically, or do you see the issue maybe more in the actual criteria of getting in? I don't know.
Well, maybe to come back to that picture of the door that is open, maybe you need to walk through and get someone. So if there's people that are overrepresented and people that are underrepresented, to extend on Anna Sophia's thought, then maybe it's the task of the overrepresented population to allocate resources for underrepresented people. And whether that's financial resources or other aspects that are needed, that's something we can try out, or that people can try out. But I think it's not fair to say, well, the door's open, go through, which I don't think anyone said, but that wouldn't be fair. Fair would be to say, okay, if apparently there's still reasons why people cannot attend or won't attend. So let's make it more possible. Let's even try to limit those last steps that can't be taken by those people that we would like to have represented in those areas or in those communities too.
I think also what you said now that reminds me that I think the big issue is transparency, even in the youth sector. I think that the reason why there is also a very concentrated people of the same kind of person who's attending this is because these opportunities are circulating only in these circles anyways. So for example, I know that here the opportunities, they don't have a centralized platform that you can go to. You find out through people who you've met at a different conference, and then they make groups and they circulate out, would you want to participate here? And they invite you. So I think maybe if it's more transparent as well, maybe centralized, depending on, I guess it's contingent on where you're from, that would also be helpful in just, knowing that there is a door to begin with that you could go through. It's not even an issue, maybe that you don't feel confident enough, but not even knowing that there is that opportunity.
Does that also relate to because you talked about institutional distrust. Why? Why is there this distrust in institutions?
Well, I think that the distrust in institutions was mainly more on a more global scale. I think it wasn't so much. I think that here, I can only speak from my experience. I think there is trust in local institutions, but the higher it goes in governance level, that trust kind of sort of dwindles or I don't know, what decreases. I think that there is more trust in the local entities there, and globally they feel like they also don't have any access anymore to that, and they can't voice their opinions there, but they can do that maybe with their representative locally.
What about sort of individual trust when you have a problem, or you need to talk to somebody, or you just need some advice? You know, what kind of a person do you go to, or do you just work it out on your own?
Is this to everybody?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Personally, like if I had a problem, I think I always just go to like family. I wouldn't go to like, even though like there is like psychiatrists, this kind of thing. Usually I would go to someone that knows me in a personal level than like a big institute. Because I guess it is kind of scary to go to like an institute, some people that don't know you, and then they're going to say like, this is what you're about without really knowing you. And I think a lot of people feel this kind of, even though like technically it's logical that they probably know you more through science and this kind of thing, like a psychologist, people are scared to go to these places, I think.
Yeah, and this is the trouble with institutions, period, right? They tend to be impersonal, right? And generally indifferent. And so it's hard. It's hard to build trust in an institution that doesn't seem to recognize you even as a person, let alone a person who can add something. Right? Yeah.
If I might just add, connecting this back to institutions, I think that like even if institutions do really want to, you know, hear young people out and listen to the concerns that we have and accommodate for like each individual concern, institutions still have like, you know, they still have to make sure that they can run themselves, and they have to make decisions, unfortunately, kind of sometimes as a business. So even if they really, really do want to listen and help in some way, I think that there is a barrier in the fact that like institutions have to also make sure that they can survive.
That's a really good point, Fiona. I was thinking the other day, I was a dean for a long time, and people would tell me, "Oh, listen, the faculty don't worry about the faculty's problems because they just want to be heard, right? So just listen to them." And I thought, well, I've been a faculty member for a long time, and you know, yeah, you do want to be listened to, but you also want to see some results, right? You want to make sure that whatever you've heard has some effect, has something happens as a result, right? It's not enough just to listen. I think we had an experience here. You know, I mean, all of you are aware of the very, very serious racial struggles in the United States, and there are a lot of efforts to incorporate communities of color increasingly. We have a small town here, and we have an African-American community, and we sat around the other day with the leaders of that community, and we all went around introducing ourselves, and we all sort of, you know, expressed our liberal credentials, you know, how we've been so concerned and so involved all these years and so forth and so on. And you know, that we were there to listen. We were there to listen, that this is what had been missing, right? And so these African Americans looked back at us and they said, "Where have you been for the last 200 years? Right? You listening to it now? Right? Listening stage is over. There's nothing more to hear. You know exactly what it is. You know exactly what the problem is. Let's sit down and talk about action. Let's not sit down and talk about words." I thought, oh, that's a different viewpoint, right? But it's an important one, and I think in our country at least, we're at that inflection point. People are tired of listening, and I presume that's the case among European youth as well.
Well, let me turn the discussion, if I may, a little bit, kind of turn the table, because I heard two things, one from Fiona yesterday and then Anna Sophie today. And Fiona, you mentioned yesterday that when Tune asked you, well, who are your heroes? And then you said, I don't want any hero. I don't trust. I want to speak just people. And then today from Anna Sophie, we heard that young people do not organize themselves. Now, so it would be good to hear from you. I mean, of course, we can talk about the adults, the institution, and criticize them. But what can you say about this? That young people do not want to be organized, and they don't want to have the models or something. How you then want to put your stamp on things in the world, and it's a good it's an observation, but also a barrier. But I would like to hear from you.
I think it's really interesting that you bring this up, because I think this plays a little bit into my paper. But I think we have a lot of vibrant youth activist organizations that are working at the ground level to create change. And I think even though they're very niche in the sense that they're geared towards very specific things, in their approach, they target some of the larger challenges we face today. And so I think, when Anna was talking about how local institutions have a higher level of trust among individuals than sort of like those more abstract, larger institutions, I think the key is to sort of formulate a bottom-up approach that empowers these local institutions and sort of amplifies their voice, instead of like building a hierarchical sort of system that just creates, more layers to get through in order to get your voice heard.
I think, at least in my conversation, like I think that young people really do want to organize. I think that something that's kind of overwhelming for, I guess I'll say us, is just like there's so many things that we want to fix. And in my conversation as well, we were talking about, like, someone mentioned that it was detrimental to their mental health, like being so overwhelmed with all of these things that are wrong in the world, and like wanting to contribute and feeling like they have to, and feeling like it's our burden, but at the same time, like not wanting to like wanting to take care of themselves as well, so they can just make it through studying and their day, and yeah.
I think, if I may, I would like to just maybe elaborate what the point was also from my side. It's not so much that the young people don't organize themselves. They just don't organize themselves in the traditional modes of political activism. They're not part of the unions, and that, of course, that's part of a lot of them not working yet, but they're not part of unions. They're not really party members. They organize themselves, as people said, they're activists on the ground who are maybe in a climate change organization, in an animal rights thing, or whatever it may be, but they're not in these traditional forms. So maybe it's, so that's why I say maybe it's consciously, in some cases unconsciously overlooked, because these spheres just don't overlap. So I think that in this case, then it's the onus is on the politicians to also seek those venues out. For example, in Croatia, the youth organization or the youth council is illegal. Why? I mean, so that's a thing. Like they had to make their underground movement. And at the EU Youth Conference in Croatia, they weren't even represented there. They had the government put their own youth participants, and they kind of tokenize these people to speak on behalf of the youth, when the actual youth council is deemed illegal and was there just, they organized their side events, and they were honestly way more helpful than the actual institutions that were there. So I think that at some times it's planned to be exclusionary, and other times it's simply because just different modes of organization. I don't know. And I would love to hear how other people, especially because I know a lot of you are active in civil society, how you think those could maybe merge more together, or you'd think that it can't be done.
I think, well, personally, I think there's a bit of a catch-22, which is sort of what we talked about with internships too. But like these organizations, they don't have as much access to traditional sources of funding, precisely because they are young and they're working in niche areas, and they necessarily don't have steady incomes. But unless they get this funding, they can't really expand their activities in order for them to be heard. And that sort of keeps going on and on and on. And in the beginning, everyone's really enthusiastic, but how long does that go on, right? So I think that's a sort of like crucial juncture that needs to be fixed.
I think there's one important aspect, because I feel like our generation often gets active, but they don't really engage in conversations. Because yesterday we also talked about the importance of conversations. And I see, for example, a lot of my friends, they post things on social media about activism. They go to protests, but only very few of them actually talk with people. Like, I feel like it's a lot of blaming going on in our world. Like, it's about climate change. Oh, the generation above us, they don't do enough, so we blame them for that. And then there's always like people blaming others, but not really finding solutions together. So I feel like we really need more conversation. And it's true that we really have to organize ourselves so that we don't just say what the problems are, but that we actually come together, and not only people who already have the same opinion, but people with different opinions. Because often I feel like it's very, very close groups who all have the same opinion, and then they all just shout at people and say like, okay, this is the right thing, and just can't you see it? But maybe they can't see the other perspective. So I think conversation is all, again, a very important part.
Good. Well, that's yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Christoph. Did you?
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to mention that once we were talking about the participation of youth, I think there is also an issue in family backgrounds. At least in my country, there is like this almost inherited like notion that your parents tell you like, oh, we never really got hurt in the decision-making process, so you won't as well. And there is this part of young population, I feel like, at least in the East Europe, they never even got the chance to participate because their parents told them that your voice will never be heard, basically.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's not only about your family, or it's also about your society circle, from schools, from university, from government, from your neighbors. Yeah, sometimes they're trying to pressure you to think that you can change anything.
I think maybe to point that out also now, because you mentioned that, I think we're also forgetting that sometimes it's just really dangerous to do that too. I know people who do put themselves in dangerous positions if they raise their voice. So I mean, I am talking from a privileged position of like, oh, how do we get heard? I mean, it's also just dangerous to put yourself out there sometimes. But what was one solution that I thought actually was quite good also when our discussion was lowering the voting age to 16. On a European level, on the EU elections, some countries have it, some don't, so there's like discrepancy. But if young people would even just be included in that demographic of what politicians would have to target when they're doing campaigns, that would already, I think, help a lot, because then whether it's disingenuous or not, but you do have to then try to actually target this group and enter dialogue, because now there is absolutely no incentive, or it seems there is no incentive to do that.
I have a little problem with this argument, because I feel like if we lower the age, then we really have to make sure that the people get proper information. Because especially if you're young, you can't really distinguish correct information, and you get influenced a lot by, I don't know, the personality of a politician. So I feel like a lot of young people just vote for the person who's the most appealing to them, who's the most nice, like the nicest person, whatever. And if we really want to lower the age, we really have to make sure that people get correct information and that they don't get influenced, because young people simply tend to get influenced more rather than looking at the facts. So I do think this is a good idea, but we can't just lower the age and that's it. Like if we do that, then there has to be a second step, and then we have to make sure that it's organized and that people have equal access. So I think it's very bold to just say we should lower the age. I think there's a lot more that we need to change in that case.
So I work with 14 to 16-year-olds basically 3 to 4 times a week. And they're the most interested, most open-minded, and politically active people that I interact with in my daily life. And that would actually maybe come back to your earlier point about just blaming going on, that when you actually feel like you're listened to by politicians because your voice and your vote makes a difference, then bringing forward solutions and holding others accountable can be way more effective and way more shaping of political discourse and political development than when you're just on the sidelines and not able to voice your concerns by voting. That's my opinion on that.
Well, let's say whatever more we have to say for a final discussion, and we can take a break now or not take a break now. It's up to you all, really. So we'll go by nods of heads. How many people would like to take a break? Either up or down. How many people would not like to take a break? That would be this way. Okay. All right. So let's continue on. I'll pass this on to Toon. Thank you for very, very lively time up until now, and we will just continue it because we don't want to lose momentum here.
Yes, let's put some more ideas on the table because there's a lot of ideas and maybe things will come together. Maybe Ananya, would you want to go first?
Hi.
Hi.
So I just wanted to say that it's been a really interesting discussion so far, and hopefully I can contribute a little bit more to it. So for my research, as I hinted earlier, I conversed with members of 2 youth activist groups, and that probably already biases my results a little bit, I suppose. But before I start going on about what I discussed with them, I'm going to give you a tiny bit of context into who they are. So one of them, Repeat, works towards peatland conservation. And I don't know how many of you know about peatlands. They're kind of like the underdogs of ecosystems. They're often considered to be wastelands, but they're in fact the largest natural terrestrial carbon stores on Earth, and they can prove monumental in our fight against climate change. And the other group is The Great Imagining. They're educational innovators, and they want to change the traditional education system to make it more creative, diverse, and individual-driven. And I think I can sum up the output of my discussion in 2 words, actually. The first being misinformation, and the second, re-education. And I think already you can sort of see how these 2 concepts might complement each other. So the reality of today is that we live in a technological era that feeds us information meant to confirm our existing biases. We don't really have substantial access to alternate viewpoints, and this is something that results in a quite polarizing effect. And I think this is visible all across the world in the violent clashes we see between groups of people. And so in the end, this idea of misinformation can be broadened to a general ignorance that breeds apathy towards some of the most important challenges we face today, be it the environmental crisis or effective decolonization or patriarchy. And well, according to my discussions, I think our generation has started to pick up on that. So the groups I talked to were quite mobilized around the idea of re-education. And I think the term re-education is quite important because it emphasizes an unlearning in a way and promotes active questioning of what is considered to be the norm, of educational structures, of peatlands, and reshaping them. Interestingly, as I mentioned before, these groups work in very niche areas, but because of this emphasis on re-education, I think their scope of consideration becomes quite large. So to give you a quick example, when Repeat asks you to see peatlands as valuable, they're questioning the sort of colonial narrative of labeling something as a space of nothingness, which is up for grabs. And they're looking to change capitalist exploitation and introducing a respectful and healing approach towards natural spaces. And so you can already begin to pick up on the kind of multiplicity that's evident in their arguments. And the connections which are forming in the nexus of politics or ecology, philosophy, economics, etc. And I think that sort of multidimensional consideration is our strongest suit to combat misinformation. And it is what makes me hopeful about the future. I think this desire for multiplicity also demands that we collaborate between generations. And this is something that has already come up in our discussion so far. Many of the members I talked to also talked about being dismissed due to their age as naive or uneducated. I already mentioned this, but they found it quite hard to access funding to amplify their voices. And I think that this is something we need to rectify. And for the future, I hope to see greater involvement of these youth activist organizations in traditional political and policy formulation institutions, just as I hope to see the older generations in Zoom conversations with us, like the one we have today. And yeah, on that note, I will end this. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful, Ananya. Thank you so much. That's really interesting because it is indeed about, well, changing your mind and having new ideas. And the curse of being old is that, well, after 25, people don't change their ideas very often. And older generations, they are indeed set in their ideas because life has confirmed their ideas. And now the situation has changed. And then, right, they're confronted with people who have different ideas. And that's where the tension seems to
Yeah,
be.
exactly.
So how can you re-educate people? Did you talk about how can you re-educate people to be open to new ideas?
So one thing that I found really interesting was that these organizations work in a very multimodal way. And when I say that, what I mean is you combine traditional forms of dissemination of information, say like articles or conferences, with very modern techniques such as like meme making, in order to sort of get your information across to this completely new demographic that you're targeting. For example, even me personally, I first noticed these organizations through their social media, and they had quite a pleasing aesthetic. They had a lot of fun videos. They had engaging content, and that's how I slowly started getting involved with them and began to learn more about the scientific side of things or the economic side of things. And so that multimodality, I think, really works to the advantage of these organizations and the demographic that they're targeting.
Yeah, but of course they're targeting the young people. But, well, the people who need to be re-educated are, well, us.
I think, again, that if these organizations start working and collaborating with more traditional institutions, then that seeps in. So, for example, because, again, they're combining traditional modes of dissemination with those modern means, they're sort of playing to both fields.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree, there is a bit of a loophole there. I do think that's something we need to maybe rethink a little bit. But yeah.
Wonderful. Well, let's park that for a second and go on to Angelica.
All right, so my main theme, even though actually everybody in my group kind of had very different thoughts, and everybody had like their own worries, everybody shared that our generation has the most knowledge and ability to gain knowledge, just that we are pretty powerless, either that we don't have money or we're not taken seriously, or that we just need to get older to gain more wisdom with the knowledge that we gain. But it was definitely that because of our knowledge, though, we have become better. We have gained more empathy. One of my friends gave an example saying that an ex-schoolmate that she was with used to get bullied a lot, but now through social media, she was able to share it and people were equally supportive. And this was something we both agreed that probably even 5 or 10 years ago might have not been a case for somebody. So our generation can be supportive for each other with these new issues because we understand issues of racism and mental health and prejudice, that it's kind of better in this light that we are more able to understand each other, even if we don't experience ourselves. But definitely there was some criticism that for young people that we need to learn how to not, what my one friend, she uses the word mob mentality, that she feels like people sometimes pick on one person because maybe they don't know so much from others, and that the people attack them. And her background is coming from Iran, says like seeing this reflects her to how it is when she's in Iran with religious people and how they attack others. And so that's why she doesn't like this, because she feels like this is very similar, just in a different light. But I think also, especially with liberal arts students, they feel more overlooked than let's say the same generation in different fields. Like I have a friend in chemistry who doesn't feel this feeling of being dismissed because she feels like in a very hard science, people do look up to her and see her. But people in liberal arts, some of my friends who are in psychology or in arts, they definitely feel like first that their parents don't support them and that they would rather have them pick a different kind of field. And also politically and just socially, people look down on people in these fields or don't take their opinions as seriously as someone else in another major. But yeah, so I think I'm done.
Okay, but it's really interesting because, of course, traditionally people say that knowledge equals power. And you seem to think, and your people you spoke to seem to think that you can have the knowledge but not have any power.
Yeah, it's kind of like the feeling that you know some things are wrong, but you can't do anything because there's other people in power making these decisions. You just can know why this decision is wrong and have an opinion on it, but can't really do anything. Is, I guess, the feeling for many people in my generation.
Well, that's really interesting. Because of course, and that's why perhaps people resort to this mob mentality. Is there a link there? The powerlessness resulting in people being so frustrated that they pick on whoever they can pick?
Yeah, I guess because it's out of frustration, out of having a voice. So people do gang together and try to I think it feels like you're doing something, but then in the end, it might create more damage than help. Because I think people that are getting attacked, they will just bear down to their old beliefs and they won't be open to change. And then it kind of makes things worse in the end.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Because then those people can make themselves into victims. And I think that's what we've seen and that can be more, I think, dangerous. And they're not open to change their beliefs.
Why is that dangerous? Can you explain?
Because I think it makes people lash out in dangerous ways. And I think we've definitely seen it, especially in the US. We've seen it happen that people will be accused of something. And then instead of saying, I'm sorry, they usually will lash out angrily. And it just continues the ball rolling of people arguing instead of getting an apology back.
Oh, okay.
And I've seen sometimes it's happened where the lash out is actually physically attacking.
And so it is that frustration that is translating into that kind of behavior.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, that's an interesting relationship that we might want to come back to. But first, Lola Witzel.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Lola and I'm studying at University College Freiburg. And in my discussion, we really talked a lot about the influence of technology on our generation. And we identified a few problems that we believe our generation has to address. I don't have clear solutions, but I mean, that's why we are discussing about it. So there are two major themes. So the first one, in our discussion, we really talked a lot about were fake news, propaganda, and rumors. Because our generation has maybe the privilege or not the privilege to get information from anywhere about anything. So it's very easy for information to spread due to this advanced technology. And sometimes I feel like there's too much technology out there, so people can't really decide what source they should believe in, etc. And I personally see it a lot in these times of Corona. So for example, in Germany, there's a whole movement against Corona. They call the government dictatorship. They question the whole pandemic as such, and some of them also believe in the chips and the vaccines. So there's a lot of information out there, and especially if you join a certain movement, you only get your information from certain sources, only from people who have the same view as you. And it's hard to really go out there and look for information in a very neutral way, not only from one source. And I feel like it's very hard because there's just too much out there. And there are some solutions there, but I feel like there's a very fine borderline to freedom of speech and expression. So in our discussion, we, for example, talked about a scenario in which the state would hire people who detect false information. But in this scenario, these people would have to be extremely neutral. And we don't think that this is possible. And we also don't think that this should be a solution because this is simply too much. But then there are other solutions, for example, that in Germany, under every post about Corona, there's a link which leads you to the official government website so that people can get their information from official sources. But I barely know people who actually clicked on that link. So there are ideas, but all of them are not very ideal. Like it's always something that's not good about them. And we have to kind of address this topic and find solutions that actually work. And then the second aspect we talked a lot about was social media, because on the one hand, it's very positive because it's a source of information and we can share culture and there are so many kinds of social interaction, which is great. But then on the other hand, there are also feelings such as always the feeling of missing out, body shaming. It's kind of contradictory to what we heard before, that people can share their feelings, but I feel like there's also a lot of negativity coming out of it because of the comparison we also talked about before. And then there's one major thing, and I'm not sure if there are other people who share this problem with me or like this concern. So the technology gives us the possibility to really connect with the whole world. So we can basically see how other people live in other countries and we can see their culture, etc. And I feel like sometimes people lose a little the contact to their own culture. So I do think that globalization kind of leads to a loss of culture. But then again, in our discussion, we realized that this is not even that bad. Like I personally think it's very sad. But on the other hand, if there is a national, continental or global culture, it doesn't matter, like we could still move on. But we realized that there's another problem that kind of has the roots in that, is that people also feel like they don't really feel responsible for their own country anymore. Because through social media, we always have other people's life like vividly in front of us. So we can always see what they're doing, whatever. And then sometimes if something really goes wrong in your own country and you always have these other lives right in front of you, it's quite an incentive to just emigrate. Like people don't really feel this responsibility to just stay there, because nowadays it's so easy to just move to another country to build on new life, and it's almost too easy. So we took the example of a pro-democratic person in a non-democratic country. And maybe back in the days, people would be more eager to really fight for the country, but instead now they just emigrate because they just have this other life right in front of them and it already exists. So why to change something if it's already out there? So we really thought that this problem is often overlooked because people don't realize that it's actually quite a big thing. And then also this immigration leads to immigration to hotspots, and then new problems like are there. For example, there is a growing competition because there's a growing population. So it is a big thing, and we believe that we really have to address the roots, and that we kind of maybe sometimes try to address the wrong things, and that really the core of these problems is somewhere else, and that we can't really detect the core. So yeah, there's a lot to do, and we really realize that this is a big thing, but we can't really understand how to address it. So it's very hard and complex. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lola. Very interesting. Because I think it addresses this issue of the mobility of this generation, right? This generation is sort of all over the place. And because they're all over the place, they're nowhere for very long. And maybe that makes it hard to have an impact.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you think that's an issue? Was that a theme that people felt that because they were somehow rootless, always moving from place to place, from subject to subject, that they never built up the connections to really engage with the existing power structures?
Well, I mean, there is a tendency I see here in Germany with a lot of friends of mine, that the majority of friends always say, oh, I don't like Germany, I don't like the people here, they're also rude. And then they always say, oh, but look there in the world, like I want to go to Italy, people are much nicer. And they always think about going away. They don't really think about changing something. And at least in my environment, I mean, I'm studying in Germany in international programs. So there's still a lot of Germans. And sometimes I feel like we have to start small, like we have to first see what we can actually change. Like if we don't like Germany, then let's change it. Let's just not go to another country which we like more. So I do think that there's something wrong and that we have to address it, and that globalization is not always good.
Ananya, was that discussed amongst your friends?
Yes,
we didn't discuss.
Sorry. Go for it.
We didn't discuss globalization as such. But I think it'd be really interesting because the organizations I talked to are looking to expand to a more world encompassing area of operation, which I think is, again, an interesting combination because they haven't really affected as much change yet in their own specific home base, so to say, but they're already looking to form connections globally. So I wonder how that impacts the movement, you know?
Well, it might thin it out, right? It might make it more difficult to engage with the local power structures.
Exactly. So there is this desire always to go global and to go international. So I resonate with that.
But don't you think that at the same time, it makes it easier to share best practice and to share creative processes in trying to find new solutions?
That is, but again, there would be a drawback there, as in where do you implement those creative processes, you know? So there's always a trade-off, of course, but I think it merits some studies.
Okay. Angelica, was that a thing amongst your peers? A concern with the global nomads who are moving from place to place?
I think most of the people I interviewed are the people like traveling to Europe, because most of my friends are students that are from other countries that became students in Europe. Like my one friend in McDaniel's from Iran, or my other friend I interviewed from China. McDaniel, a lot of them actually are students that are like not born European people. I mean, there is, but a lot of them are international students from other countries. So we didn't really think about this so much.
Because of course that's the power, right? And that's where the knowledge doesn't translate into the power.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it just didn't, I guess, never occurred to any of my friends or even me about it. But I guess they would all have different reasons of why they left their countries and wanted to study in Europe.
But did anybody else, I mean, for all of you, did any of you talk to people and see a difference between people who were studying in their own countries or people who were studying from someplace else?
Well, I think I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I noticed such a huge difference for those who weren't there yesterday in the students who were from Europe and those who were from like a studying abroad sort of like, especially people who are from countries that are maybe not like looked upon at like that coming from those countries with the passport that they have in Europe kind of is a disadvantage for them. And I think that the concerns that they had were a lot more existential for them personally than the concerns that the rest of us had.
Did anybody else run into this? Julia, I see you.
Oh, sorry. I don't know who's talking.
Julia, I thought you were.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I wanted to tell that, Lola, I like your topic about media because, yeah, now we can see the rise of civil journalistic because everybody has phones and internet. So we can have our own news and our own journalistic activity. But here's also, yeah, that's why we need media literacy. We need to know how to read articles and how to do the fact checking. But here's also not only minuses, also pluses, because, for example, if we're talking about autocratical and dictatorship government, it's harder for them to control the information because we have a lot of ways to get the another and opposite information. What about to move to other countries? now it's not so easy in passport. Yeah, and for example, what about changes in our own places? We are still in a cell of our nationality, and because even here in Poland, it's like European country, but women here are protesting every year because of they have a struggle of the right to abortion, and they changed nothing. Unfortunately, they changed nothing. So I can understand people who are moving to another country because we have only one life, and yeah, we're trying to find a better place for ourselves.
Because I think one of the big themes that people are frustrated by in all of the presentations that we saw today had to do with rights and rights that were not being respected. Whether it's indeed right to personal liberty, right to participation, rights of expression, etc. Was that a topic that came up, this issue of rights and how we protect rights better?
I don't know. I think one thing that I mentioned in my paper, and I think this also ties a little bit into what we're saying about leaving a place, is this connection between the people, the demos, and the state is changing, in my opinion, too. I feel like it's seen more of the state is seen more like a store that you get things, you get your rights from, and certainly legitimately you should be getting those, but you're not giving anything back in a sense. So I can see where, like, for example, there was you can disagree, or I mean, I personally disagree with the like army mandatory thing that you have to do in some countries, but my point is, like, seems to be, and also what is going in the discourse now that I was like against the COVID regulations, people don't give in anything, but they want to take. So like the state is really just like a store of, not just rights, but things that they feel entitled to, without ever getting back. Like completely the sense of community is eliminated. So I can kind of see where Lula is coming from, with once that whole nature changes, then that becomes really problematic. On the other hand, when you mentioned, people who move around, like that's very close to my reality. I also think that I should not be talking in the place of someone who has grown up here all the time. Like, it's not my place to do that. I wasn't socialized here in that sense, and that's why I think that in some cases I also shouldn't, I shouldn't pretend to be that, and it has its own leverage points, but I should not take up the space then.
Anna raises an interesting point. It just reminds me that one of the principles of liberal arts education, although it's more covert than overt, is to educate and prepare citizens for democracy. And so that, the kinds of skills that you learn, the critical thinking and the being able to express yourself, and orally and in written form, and being able to collaborate and so forth, those are all meant to be tools to be used within particular societies. And I don't know whether you sense that in your education or whether you don't, but that's one of the basic principles of the kind of education that you're receiving. Whether it's having any effect or not, we don't know, but over time, we think it will.
And maybe one way of making that a concrete question is, if you could somehow address the generations who have come before you and make a pitch, hey, you should take us more seriously. You should give us more opportunities. You should, right? What do you think you have to give? What's the pitch that you want to make to the people in power? What do you have to give? What are your assets? What do you bring to the party? What are they missing out on because they're not taking you very seriously, or at least not seriously enough? Because they're not giving you what you think you should be getting, the source of your frustrations.
A lot of you mentioned the uniqueness of your generation, and so but without spelling out particularly what those unique factors were. So I think, what do you have to offer?
Well, if I may jump in, among my peers, there was this consensus, like our generation has this innovativeness in them, that we can like introduce new models of, well, basically anything. I'm not sure myself, like what did they mean exactly, but that we are able to think outside of a box.
I think I'd kind of pick up from that and say that in the end, I mean, there are drawbacks to living in a technological age, but then we're also the generation living in the technological age, which means that we have an unprecedented skill for the innovation that Christoph was talking about. And we have the power to sort of reach an unprecedented amount of people as well because of technology. And so I think that sort of potential for mass scale engagement is sort of unique to our generation.
I have to say that I feel like I would push back on that a bit. Like, I don't think there's anything unique about this generation as such in terms of qualities. Maybe, yeah, okay, we're sensibilized to more issues and we have technological skills or whatever that may be, but we can clearly see media literacy is still not a thing. But what I do, I like, especially I think the one benefit, and that has nothing to do with this generation, but just with a young generation, is that there's no political fatigue yet. Like, I know that, I don't know for people here, but parents' generations and them, they were also active and there were big movements also in the 90s and I don't know what. And then they kind of felt like, I think that's where it comes from. Also, I think Christoph mentioned it, where your parents say, well, there is no point in getting it, you don't get heard. It's because also in some cases, failed attempts of organizing yourself or getting something actually implemented, that kind of thing. So I think, if anything, it's like political fatigue is not really so much affecting us right now. And yeah, sure, technology, but yeah, I don't think there's something so unique as such as a skill set. I don't know.
I want to ask something, Lola, but Lola, you wanted to say something before. Please say, because I want to ask you something different.
Yeah, to the question that was just asked, what I think what is different that our generation has and others not is that we were simply born with the problems already there. So I feel like with the generations before us, there were, sometimes I have this image, maybe it's wrong because I haven't lived there, but so I feel like there were changes, like really changes, like suddenly people had to learn how to accept this and this and this, and we were basically born into it, so we see it as something normal. And I picked this up in my report when it came to the example of discrimination and tolerance. So I feel like from the generations before us, we learned that we have to always tolerate people, especially people we are not very who have a culture that we're not familiar with. But I feel like what our generation has is that for us it's normal. For us it's normal that we get in contact with different people who have different values than we have. So I feel like what our generation has is that we have the problems right in front of us, and they're nothing in theory, but we actually practice this kind of living. So we don't just tolerate people, but we're actually interested in them, and we just see that something normal. So we don't have to learn how to behave, but we grew up with it. And I feel like this, at least in some parts of our society, this is really different. I mean, since I'm a small child, climate change was always a thing. And then in the generations before us, people had to learn that this is actually important. And I feel like this is something that distinguishes our generation. I agree with Anna Sophie that we don't really have anything like that's really unique about us. But I do think that we grew up in a different age where problems were addressed differently than in the generations before us. So we also have different solutions and a different mindset, in my opinion.
Actually, I think that's a really great point. What I can deduce from your answer, which I didn't take into consideration before, is not just are we having like different the problem approach is different, but I think that with that comes we take things for granted too. Like I know that I take a lot of the EU programs for granted, like Erasmus and going, being able to go to a different uni for a semester. I do take that, or it slowly becomes a thing that you take for granted too. So I think now that you mentioned that, I do see that.
I have one really, really quick comment that I do think that that our generation does have something unique and special in that we've grown up in an age where we can learn things really easily. Like we have access, if you have access to the internet. I know so many people who have taught themselves skills and online, and I think that that is something that's really special about us.
Anyone to respond to Lola, because then I want to ask him, but it was so fascinating. Maybe you still want to respond to her. No? Okay, Lola, I was really fascinated by your take that the youth goes for the global and forgets the local. And perhaps it is because, you know, the Facebook is global, internet is global, Netflix is global, traveling around is the globe. And then so the local, it's small, dangerous, sometimes isolated. So it's rather inconvenient. Well, are you lured by the vision that the global is so prevalent everywhere, you know, the Facebook, internet, Netflix? Is it that what takes the young people, young generation to this global saving the world while forgetting to say hello to your neighbor?
Yes, I do think so, because even this expression of say hello to your neighbor, it's actually true, because sometimes people are connected with people all over the world, and then they really lose the sense of this local community. And I feel like people always have this vision that they escape from the local community to enter the global world, but this is not the case. And sometimes I feel a lot of people my age frustrated, and I feel like they can't get out of these small circle they're in, that they always see the same people. And then, for example, at school, people are like, oh, they're always the same people. We can't really have contact to new people. And then I go to university, and then after a year, they say the same thing. So I feel like people always have this image that everything is global, that everything is big. And then suddenly when they find themselves in these small communities, they don't really know how to behave. They don't know what they should do. And they always think if you want to make a big impact, then you have to have a lot of social media influence or whatever, even though maybe small conversation would already help. And I really feel that our generation sometimes loses this feeling of a small community, and that maybe the small contacts matter more than making a big impact on an international ground. So I'm not really sure if this is a problem or if it's actually an opportunity, but I do see some problems in that. And I don't think that it's always very good to put everything on a very international and global level. But yeah, I still don't know that much about I really have to see the next years how my opinion on that develops. But right now I'm definitely not only on the positive side, let's say it like this.
But that rather relates to how we go on with this. Because, well, Ecolas started this project in a somewhat open way, right? We first had the survey and you fill that in, and then you had the conversations, and then you wrote the reports, and now we have this conversation. The question then becomes, what do we do with this? And I guess we as an organization, as Ecolas, don't really know. But when you have all these concerns, what do you want us to do with them? How do we take this forward? Who do you think should hear this?
I mean, I remember you asked this question yesterday, and we basically, again, came back to the small communities. So I don't feel like we should make this whole thing big and try to reach as many people at once. But I feel like everyone who attends this discussion right now, who watches the live stream or whatever, will continue the conversations on a local level. And I think only this can actually lead to something big. Because otherwise, I mean, we should really take things apart and start at different points and not just have one big thing and we try to make it as visible as possible, but it's really about the small things, in my opinion.
Adding on to what Lola's been saying, there's a book called On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder. And I just remember, like, I mean, I really liked, I think the way he approaches it is pretty practical, and like you can incorporate it into his recommendations into your life. But one thing that stuck with me was like knowing your neighbors and you know, just having that human interaction, because I think there's something special about that, and maintaining the connections there.
Okay. Did you have fun in this? And I asked this question yesterday as well, but just as a way of closing off, because I see the attention span dwindling a little bit.
Before that, and then I hope you had it and you will tell, can I suggest something? And then Christoph might remember that from my classes. I always ask at the first year, I ask the students to have a conversation with their grandparents or someone of the grandparents' age, not parents, not parents, because with the parents is attention, but the grandparents. And often I noticed that was perhaps real for the first time in their life, the first serious conversation with their grandparents. Would you consider that as enriching the local conversation, to speak to those who are older? And the most haunting conversation was about the communist past of those older people. And there was the one students who had the neighbor whom she was terrified of, but then she talked to him, and then he explained to her his suffering, and that's why he was so brown and bad. Would that something be of meaningful continuation, as part of the one continuation, to have a conversation on the local level with people whom you met, but don't even dare to ask because they are older, they might be actually looking down upon or you don't know how to communicate with them? Is there anything appealing in there or not?
You know what? I find the question a bit weird, because I feel like that's what we're constantly doing. I as in, like, the whole conversation is between different generations to begin with. But I see your point where, like, we try to do it always, and also what Lola was saying, on a more global level, we try to, but not really on a local one. I think that would definitely be an asset, but I don't see that as I feel like that's the imperative, that's paramount to do. That shouldn't be something that can aid the conversation. That is the conversation, I don't know.
Much easier to talk to people that you already know, or the people that you know you have a lot in common with, than the people that you don't have a lot in common with.
Sure, I mean, that has to be inclusive. Like, it's not that you just talk to people that you're like agreeing with.
It's just an observation, but this tension between wanting to save the world and wanting to save the street that you live on is really not that new. What is new, what I'm hearing new from you, is that you're thinking that maybe we should start by saving the street that we live on. And previous generations, I think, took a long time to get around to that. I know my own, when I was your age, we were saving the world. We were, capitalism was dead. The Vietnam was a huge mistake. And there was nothing local. It was all saving the world. And I think that's been generally true of people your age. But I hear a different tone from you all, and I find great comfort in that, if in fact that's the direction you're heading.
Which brings us to the end of this webinar. And the question that I asked yesterday, I want to ask to certainly the people who have presented today again. This whole process, the survey, the conversation, the report, this webinar, having these conversations, did you enjoy it? What did it bring you? Was it a meaningful and instructive experience? Can I start with Julia?
Yeah, thank you for the conversation. But I can feel that we are different with a different experience and different background. And sometimes I understand that, yeah, my English is not so good, unfortunately.
You're doing great.
Thank you, I'm trying. Yeah, and yeah, I can feel how different we are, but not in a bad meaning, just with a different background and with a different view on our future and on our reality. Yeah, so I have some things that I should think about it.
Okay, Celine, how was it for you?
I think it was very interesting, and I realized that all the different groups have very, very different ideas. I mean, a lot of common points as well, but just a lot of different ideas were brought up that I didn't necessarily think about when I was writing my report or my the survey originally. And I think that's very interesting because you can't really reduce the perspectives of the youth to a few issues. It's very diverse, and it's, I don't know, it's just very interesting and insightful in my opinion.
Okay. Wonderful. Angelica?
Yeah, I like doing this whole thing. I thought I learned a lot about my friends and about this group and about, I guess, this generation. I feel like maybe I had some like preconceived ideas before, but then some like I've been, I guess, challenged against it. But I like that I learned something new and kind of opened my mind.
Okay, Ananya?
I think this is a really interesting exercise for me as an international student as well, because I hadn't really taken as much time, say, to engage with local groups that are working around me. But I really enjoyed speaking with them. I actually started working with one of them, yay. But yeah, so it was a really good process for me personally.
Okay, wonderful. Anna-Sophie?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I know that's not a conducive feeling, but I just felt guilty a lot of the times during the conversation, to be honest, because, you know, other people have to worry about where their food comes from. And I'm talking about, you know, how can I have more avenues to participate in politically, which is obviously not mutually exclusive, but just being, again, humbled. Also what Julia is talking about, just knowing that you're from a country that you can't just protest and you can't just do that. It makes it, you know, makes the conversation, I mean, again, guilt is not conducive to anything, but if it did show us that youth is not a monolith, like we always talk about the young people, and they're always future oriented, never in the present. So yeah, I think that that's my biggest, it just confirmed that, just corroborated that view.
Okay. Of course, the thing is that, you know, the reason, well, in many ways, it's a good thing that there are people who have the time to think about these things, because if we don't, then who will? And then Lola, well, you already reflected yesterday, but just as a...
Yeah, I actually share Anna-Sophie's view, because I also was a little nervous when I was thinking about what I should present in these 5 minutes. And I thought that some things might be a little more risky. And I really like that here in this discussion felt like this was the right place to address these, because I hear a lot from others, like it's all about climate change, it's all about injustice. And sometimes I feel like there are a lot of other small problems that people don't really address, or at least not publicly. So I really like that this conversation led to these small problems, and that it's not just about the things that are already have a lot of tension, but rather smaller problems. And I really like that. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So, well, we started this whole thing to get liberal arts students to talk to each other from all across Europe, and certainly that's happened, but we've also engendered a lot of local conversations, and well, hopefully we will inspire more of those conversations, because as long as we keep talking about these issues, maybe we can actually, well, understand our frustrations and do something about them. So on that happy note, on behalf of Ecolas and everybody else who participated, thank you so much for sharing what you had to say. It's been very instructive. And I think we have, as an organization, as Nicholas, have to think about what we want to do with this. But we're very happy to have all your contributions. And well, I think we might be in touch in one capacity or another, right, Samuel?
Absolutely. And we discussed that yesterday, that you were interested in some kind of platform to create, but the key is how it's distributed. Mm-hmm. And now, when we thought yesterday about the global distribution, maybe we should think about local distribution. Thanks.
Lessons learned. Lessons learned. The education never ends.
Yeah. And then, of course, all your papers will be on our webpage, so you can read them all, and we will share it with you. And then we'll definitely be in touch because and then we hope to hear from you as well. So be patient with us. We'll write to you, and you write to us, because we feel that often it is through you. It's more that we can talk to your institution then, and that's important.
So with that, stay safe, stay inspired, keep talking, and have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.